Picture a solitary figure sitting motionless in complete darkness, surrounded by decomposing bodies, the smell of death thick in the cold mountain air. Vultures circle overhead, waiting for dawn when they will descend to consume the remains placed there according to ancient sky burial traditions. The monk does not flinch when animals approach in the night. He does not cover his nose against the stench. He sits, eyes open, observing his own mind's reactions to the ultimate taboo, the visceral reality of death and decay. To most people, this seems like macabre religious extremism, deliberately traumatizing oneself for no comprehensible reason. Yet Tibetan Buddhist tradition considers charnel ground meditation among the most profound practices for cutting through delusion and awakening to reality's true nature. If you're ready to understand why confronting death directly represents not morbid fascination but the most practical spiritual training possible, subscribe now and activate notifications to access teachings that transform fear into wisdom and aversion into liberation. The practice of meditating in graveyards and charnel grounds extends back to Buddhism's earliest days in India, long before the tradition reached Tibet. The historical Buddha himself reportedly spent time meditating in charnel grounds, and early Buddhist texts describe such practices in detail. The Satipatthana Sutta, one of Buddhism's foundational meditation texts, explicitly instructs practitioners to contemplate dead bodies in various stages of decomposition, from freshly deceased through bloating, dismemberment by animals, scattered bones, and finally dust. This contemplation serves specific purposes within the Buddhist path, purposes that remain as relevant in 2026 as they were 500 years ago, perhaps more so given contemporary culture's death denial and obsession with preserving youth. The first and most obvious reason for graveyard meditation involves confronting impermanence directly and undeniably. Impermanence stands as one of Buddhism's three marks of existence, along with suffering and non-self. While impermanence can be contemplated philosophically or observed in subtle changes, nothing demonstrates impermanence as powerfully as witnessing the dissolution of a human body. The corpse that was recently a living person with hopes, fears, relationships, and concerns now lies inert, beginning the inevitable process of returning to basic elements. The body that was cared for, adorned, protected, and identified with as self, now becomes food for scavengers and substrate for bacteria. This visceral demonstration of impermanence cuts through intellectual understanding to create gut-level realization that cannot be ignored or forgotten. Western culture carefully hides death's reality behind institutional walls and professional death care industries. Bodies are quickly removed, embalmed, cosmetically prepared, and presented in ways that minimize death's stark reality. Graveyards become manicured parks where death appears tamed, sanitized, and peaceful. This denial serves psychological protection from death anxiety, but creates profound spiritual obstacle by maintaining the illusion that death is distant, manageable, and somehow not truly inevitable for oneself. The Tibetan practitioner meditating among decomposing bodies shatters this comfortable illusion completely. Death becomes undeniable, personal, and urgently relevant. This confrontation generates renunciation, not as world-rejecting negativity but as realistic assessment that conventional pursuits cannot provide lasting satisfaction because everything is impermanent and death erases all ordinary accomplishments. The second reason concerns overcoming attachment to the body and physical beauty. Human consciousness naturally identifies with the body, treating it as self or, at minimum, as self's most intimate possession. We invest enormous energy maintaining the body's appearance, health, and comfort. Entire industries exist to help people preserve youthful appearance and delay aging's visible signs. Sexual attraction, social status, and self-worth often depend heavily on physical appearance. Yet the body's ultimate fate makes all this investment seem tragically futile when viewed from death's perspective. The beautiful body becomes the rotting corpse without exception. The charnel ground forces recognition of this trajectory, undermining attachment to physical form and beauty. This contemplation does not aim to create body hatred or rejection of embodied existence, but rather to establish appropriate relationship with the body. Instead of identifying the body as self or grasping it as permanent possession, the practitioner recognizes the body as temporary aggregation of elements borrowed from the environment and destined to return there. This recognition reduces both narcissistic preoccupation with appearance and the opposite extreme of body denial. The body becomes a vehicle for practice, something to be cared for appropriately without obsessive attachment or identification. Meditating in graveyards provides the stark evidence needed to shift from unconscious body identification to conscious recognition of the body's true nature as impermanent process rather than solid possession. The third reason involves transforming fear and aversion into equanimity and wisdom. Most humans feel instinctive revulsion toward corpses and fear of death. These reactions have evolutionary basis, protecting against disease and danger while motivating survival behavior. Yet these same instincts create suffering when they generalize into clinging to life, fear of aging, and desperate attempts to deny mortality. By deliberately confronting the objects of fear and aversion in controlled contemplative context, the practitioner gradually transforms these afflictive emotions. The first visits to charnel grounds typically generate intense fear, disgust, and desire to flee. But through repeated exposure combined with meditation practice, these reactions gradually diminish. The practitioner discovers that the fear exists in mind rather than in the corpses themselves, that the aversion is conditioned response rather than inherent property of the situation. This transformation exemplifies a fundamental Buddhist principle that applies far beyond graveyard meditation. All afflictive emotions arise from misapprehending reality, projecting qualities onto phenomena that they don't inherently possess. When we recognize that our fear of corpses comes from our minds rather than from the corpses, we begin understanding that all emotional suffering operates similarly. Anger arises not from others' actions, but from our mind's responses to those actions. Desire creates dissatisfaction, not because desired objects are inherently unsatisfying, but because we misapprehend their nature and what obtaining them can accomplish. Graveyard practice serves as intensive training ground, where the principle of mind-created suffering becomes undeniable, preparing the practitioner to recognize this principle in all life circumstances. If these insights about confronting death and transforming fear are resonating with you, take a moment to like this video so others seeking profound teachings can discover them through the algorithm. The fourth reason concerns developing compassion and bodhicitta, the awakened heart that seeks enlightenment to benefit all beings. This connection might seem counterintuitive since graveyard meditation appears focused on contemplating death's reality, rather than cultivating love and compassion. Yet the connection runs deep. When practitioners contemplate corpses, they naturally reflect that these bodies recently housed living consciousness, beings who experienced joy and suffering, who had loved ones who cared for them, who struggled with the same existential challenges all beings face. This reflection generates kinship with the deceased, and, by extension, naturally generates compassionate concern. Moreover, contemplating death reveals the preciousness and urgency of spiritual practice. If death is certain but its timing uncertain, then every moment represents potential last chance to practice, to purify karma, to benefit others, to move toward enlightenment. This urgency transforms spiritual practice from optional leisure activity into life's most essential work. The practitioner in the graveyard realizes viscerally that worldly accomplishments mean nothing at death, that only spiritual development and positive karma accompany consciousness beyond this life. This realization naturally generates bodhicitta motivation, because the practitioner recognizes that helping others develop spiritually and creating positive conditions for their practice represents the most meaningful possible activity. Conventional success, wealth accumulation, fame, and pleasure all appear as child's games when measured against death's absolute horizon. The fifth reason involves specific tantric practices unique to Vajrayana Buddhism that require charnel ground settings for maximum effectiveness. The practice of chöd exemplifies this dimension. Chöd, meaning cutting through, involves ritual offering of one's own body to spirits, demons, and all beings through elaborate visualization. The practitioner visualizes their consciousness leaving the body, transforming into a wrathful deity who dismembers the body, places it in a skull cauldron, transforms it into nectar, and offers it to satisfy the hunger of all beings. This practice combines multiple elements including confronting ego attachment, practicing radical generosity, working with fear, and invoking wrathful deity energies. Performing chöd in charnel grounds amplifies the practice's power exponentially. The presence of actual bodies being consumed by scavengers provides vivid reference for the visualization. The atmosphere charged with death energy intensifies the practitioner's focus and vulnerability. The fear arising naturally in such settings becomes fuel for transformation, rather than obstacle to overcome. Spirits and non-physical beings traditionally believed to frequent charnel grounds create conditions where the practitioner must rely completely on dharma protection and spiritual refuge rather than ordinary safety. While chöd can be practiced in any location, the graveyard setting creates conditions where the practice becomes not mere visualization, but visceral encounter with exactly what the practice addresses: ego dissolution, impermanence, and fearless offering of self for others' benefit. The sixth reason concerns initiation into deeper levels of Tantric practice and transmission of esoteric teachings. Throughout Tibetan Buddhist history, important teachings have been transmitted in charnel grounds by masters to qualified disciples. The setting serves multiple functions in such transmissions. First, it tests the student's readiness by requiring them to overcome conventional fears and taboos. A student too attached to comfort and normalcy proves unprepared for teachings that deconstruct conventional reality. Second, the setting's power and charged atmosphere facilitate transmission of subtle energetic blessings and direct introduction to awareness's nature. Third, the privacy of charnel grounds protects esoteric teachings from casual observation by those unprepared to receive them appropriately. The famous Mahasiddha Padmasambhava, who brought Buddhism to Tibet, reportedly received crucial teachings from dakinis in charnel grounds, and this pattern continues through subsequent lineages. Modern practitioners may question whether such practices retain relevance given contemporary cremation customs and regulated cemeteries that lack traditional charnel grounds' raw reality. Yet the essential principles adapt to available circumstances. Some practitioners visit morgues, spend time with dying patients in hospices, volunteer with organizations that care for deceased bodies, or participate in anatomical study to gain direct exposure to death's physical reality. While these settings differ from traditional charnel grounds, they serve similar contemplative purposes when approached with appropriate motivation and practice. The key element is not the specific setting but rather the practitioner's willingness to confront death directly, rather than avoiding or sanitizing it. The seventh reason involves awakening from the trance of ordinary perception and conventional reality. Daily life creates powerful illusion that the present situation is normal, stable, and will continue indefinitely. We make plans, accumulate possessions, develop reputation, and build identity as if current circumstances were permanent. This despite intellectual knowledge that everything changes, and death makes all conventional achievements ultimately meaningless. The gap between intellectual knowledge and lived realization is vast. Graveyard meditation collapses this gap by providing undeniable experiential evidence that ordinary reality is fragile, temporary, and ultimately illusory. The corpses were recently living people who presumably also assumed their situations were stable and would continue. Now they lie decomposing, all their plans and concerns rendered irrelevant by death. This jarring recognition functions as wake-up call from the sleep of routine existence. Practitioners emerging from graveyard meditation often report that ordinary concerns that seemed urgent before now appear trivial. Arguments about petty matters, status competitions, accumulation of possessions and pursuit of fleeting pleasures all seem absurd when measured against death's certainty. This is not nihilism or depression, but rather clear seeing, recognition of what actually matters and what represents distraction from what matters. The practitioner naturally reorients life toward what retains meaning across death's threshold: spiritual development, ethical conduct, benefiting others, and recognizing reality's true nature. Graveyard meditation serves as regular recalibration, repeatedly awakening the practitioner from the trance of conventional existence. The eighth reason concerns preparation for death itself and the bardos that follow. Tibetan Buddhism teaches extensively about the death process, the dissolution of elements and consciousness levels that occurs, and the intermediate states between death and rebirth. These teachings emphasize that preparation during life determines one's ability to navigate death successfully. A practitioner who has repeatedly confronted death through graveyard meditation familiarizes consciousness with death's reality in advance. When actual death arrives, the practitioner recognizes what is occurring rather than being overwhelmed by confusion and fear. The decomposing bodies contemplated during practice demonstrate what will happen to one's own body, preparing the practitioner to release attachment when the time comes. The fear confronted and transformed during graveyard meditation reduces fear during actual dying, allowing the practitioner to maintain awareness and recognize opportunities for liberation. Moreover, the charnel ground practice develops precisely the qualities needed for successful bardo navigation, as described in the Bardo Thodol. Equanimity amid disturbing appearances, recognition that appearances are mental projections, ability to maintain awareness during radical state transitions, and freedom from grasping at pleasant experiences or fleeing from unpleasant ones, all develop through graveyard meditation. The wrathful and peaceful deities appearing in post-death bardos might overwhelm unprepared consciousness, but practitioners accustomed to confronting death directly in graveyards will recognize these appearances with less confusion. In this sense, graveyard meditation represents perhaps the most practical preparation possible for life's inevitable final exam. What do you think about these practices? Could you see yourself undertaking graveyard meditation if given proper training and support? Or does the idea remain too challenging? Share your honest reactions in the comments as we explore these profound practices together. Contemporary psychological research provides interesting confirmation of graveyard meditation's benefits through studies of mortality salience and terror management. These studies demonstrate that reminding people of death's inevitability affects behavior and attitudes in measurable ways. Some effects are negative, increasing defensiveness, prejudice against outgroups, and clinging to worldviews, but other effects prove positive, including increased altruism, appreciation for relationships, and focus on intrinsic values over extrinsic goals. The difference appears to depend on how death awareness is processed. Defensive suppression of death anxiety produces negative effects. Conscious acceptance and contemplation produces positive transformation. This validates the Buddhist approach of directly contemplating death rather than avoiding it, suggesting that graveyard meditation's benefits are not merely religious belief, but reflect genuine psychological principles. The neuroscience of fear extinction provides additional relevant framework. Repeated exposure to fear-inducing stimuli in safe contexts gradually reduces fear response through process of reconsolidation, where fear memories are weakened. Graveyard meditation employs precisely this principle, repeatedly exposing practitioners to death-related stimuli while maintaining meditative awareness that provides safety through spiritual refuge and understanding. The gradual reduction in fear and aversion represents not mere habituation, but genuine transformation, where the practitioner's relationship with death fundamentally changes. Brain imaging studies of meditators show that advanced practitioners can regulate fear-related amygdala activity and maintain prefrontal cortical function during exposure to disturbing images, suggesting neural mechanisms for the equanimity that graveyard meditation develops. The practice also connects deeply with other foundational Buddhist contemplations, including the four thoughts that turn the mind toward Dharma. These four contemplations are precious human birth, impermanence and death, karma and its effects, and the sufferings of samsara. Graveyard meditation intensifies all four contemplations simultaneously. The precious human birth becomes undeniably precious when one sees corpses that no longer have opportunity to practice. Impermanence and death require no further proof than decomposing bodies. Karma's importance becomes clear when recognizing that only karmic accumulation accompanies consciousness beyond death. Samsara's unsatisfactory nature reveals itself when even the most successful worldly life ends in the same graveyard as everyone else's. Thus, graveyard practice serves as accelerated course in Buddhism's foundational teachings, compressing years of contemplation into visceral hours. Different Tibetan Buddhist traditions emphasize graveyard practices to varying degrees. The Nyingma and Kagyu traditions that emphasize Mahasiddha lineages and yogic practices include extensive graveyard meditation instructions. The Gelug tradition that emphasizes monastic scholarship and gradual path includes such practices, but perhaps with less emphasis. The variations reflect different pedagogical approaches rather than disagreement about the practice's value. Some practitioners require intensive shock methods to break through resistance and intellectualization. Others progress better through gradual, systematic development. Skilled teachers assess students' temperaments and prescribe practices accordingly, including whether and when graveyard meditation should be undertaken. For contemporary Western practitioners, accessing traditional graveyard practice presents obvious challenges. Most Western cemeteries prohibit nighttime presence, and cultural norms create legal and social obstacles to spending extended time among graves. Moreover, Western burial practices of sealed caskets and underground interment mean that bodies are hidden from view, eliminating the visual confrontation with decomposition that is traditional practice's essence. Some Western teachers have adapted the practice for modern circumstances, including contemplating images of decomposition, visiting anatomy museums, or working with carefully selected memento mori objects. While these adaptations lack traditional charnel ground's full impact, they capture essential principles and provide accessible entry points for practitioners drawn to this practice. The environmental and cultural dimensions of sky burial traditions that create Tibet's charnel grounds deserve mention. In Tibet's high-altitude environment with rocky soil and scarce fuel for cremation, sky burial represented practical solution for body disposal while honoring religious values. The body is ritually dismembered and offered to vultures, who consume it completely, returning the elements to nature's cycles. This practice embodies Buddhist teachings about impermanence, non-attachment to the body, and generosity, as the corpse's final act provides sustenance to other beings. The charnel grounds where sky burials occur naturally become spaces saturated with death's reality, ideal for practitioners seeking to confront impermanence directly. Understanding this cultural context helps appreciate why graveyard meditation developed so extensively in Tibetan tradition specifically. Even though the practice has roots in earlier Indian Buddhism, the question naturally arises whether such extreme practices are necessary for spiritual development or represent cultural peculiarities optional for practitioners in different contexts. The Tibetan tradition's answer is nuanced. Graveyard meditation is not considered necessary for everyone, but rather a specialized practice, suitable for certain temperaments and developmental stages. Some practitioners achieve deep realization without ever meditating in charnel grounds. Others require the intensive intervention that such practice provides to break through particular obstacles. The key is not whether specific practices are universally required, but whether practitioners engage whatever practices they undertake with full commitment, proper understanding, and qualified guidance. Graveyard meditation represents one tool in Buddhism's vast toolkit, powerful for those who need it, unnecessary for those who don't. For practitioners in 2026 considering these teachings' relevance, several applications emerge. First, deliberately contemplating death and impermanence regularly, even without visiting graveyards, provides similar benefits in terms of reorienting priorities and reducing attachment to conventional concerns. Second, confronting rather than avoiding uncomfortable realities, whether death, aging, sickness, or other aspects of existence that culture encourages denying, develops equanimity and realistic worldview. Third, practices that generate some degree of controlled discomfort, whether physical through prostrations, psychological through self-examination, or existential through death contemplation, serve spiritual development by revealing resistances and attachments that comfortable practice never challenges. These principles apply universally regardless of whether one literally practices in graveyards. The ultimate purpose of graveyard meditation reveals itself when we recognize that the practice is not really about graveyards at all. The corpses serve as mirrors reflecting our own inevitable fate, and the fear and aversion that arise reveal attachments and delusions that bind consciousness in suffering. By working directly with these reactions in the heightened atmosphere of the charnel ground, practitioners accelerate the realization that can develop more gradually through other practices. The real graveyard is the false sense of permanence, security, and solid self that ordinary consciousness maintains. Every moment that delusion dies and wisdom dawns represents the true charnel ground practice, whether occurring in a literal graveyard or in the midst of daily life. As we conclude this exploration of why Tibetan monks meditate in graveyards, recognize that the teaching ultimately invites you to confront whatever you've been avoiding. For some, this is literal death. For others, it might be relationship difficulties, career dissatisfaction, existential meaninglessness, or spiritual doubts. The principle remains constant. What we avoid persists and grows. What we confront directly with awareness transforms and liberates. The monk in the graveyard demonstrates ultimate version of this principle, but the same principle operates whenever you turn toward difficulty rather than away from it. Whenever you examine uncomfortable truth rather than maintaining comfortable illusion. Whenever you recognize impermanence rather than clinging to fantasies of permanence. What are you avoiding that requires confrontation? What comfortable illusions protect you from truths you need to face? These questions matter more than whether you'll ever literally meditate in a graveyard. The charnel ground practice teaches the method, turning toward what is rather than toward what you wish were true, maintaining awareness amid disturbing appearances, transforming fear through recognition of its empty nature, and discovering equanimity that includes rather than excludes death, difficulty, and dissolution. This is the real teaching, applicable in every moment of every life. The teaching that death can be the greatest teacher if we're willing to learn. If this teaching has given you new appreciation for Buddhism's profoundly practical methods and challenged comfortable assumptions about spiritual practice, subscribe to continue receiving content that goes beyond surface presentations to reveal Dharma's transformative power. Enable notifications so you never miss teachings that have potential to fundamentally shift your understanding and practice. Share this video with anyone ready to hear that authentic spiritual development often requires exactly what we most resist, confronting what we fear, examining what we avoid, and transforming through direct engagement with life and death's deepest realities. Together, practicing with courage and supporting each other with compassion, we can discover that the graveyard's teaching applies everywhere, that every moment offers opportunity to recognize impermanence, release attachment, and awaken to reality's true nature. May whatever merit arises from contemplating these teachings benefit all beings. May we all develop the courage to face what must be faced. May death become our teacher rather than our terror, revealing the preciousness of this life while preparing us for whatever lies beyond.